Good afternoon. I'm Christopher Morphew, Dean of the School of Education at Johns Hopkins, and I'm really excited to be here for Hopkins at Home with my good friend and colleague, John Links, Professor of Environmental Health Sciences in the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. John is also Vice Provost and the university's Chief Risk Officer, so you can imagine just how busy he's been leading the university's COVID-19 response. We're with you today to talk about safe and healthy schools. About a year ago, the School of Education created a new university-wide center, the Center for Safe and Healthy Schools. And John is a faculty affiliate who's working with us on one of our flagship projects, which is part of what we want to share with you today. So today we're going to talk about a topic that is front and center right now, safe schools. Nearly 60 million children attend public schools in our communities in the United States, and their well-being is so important to their parents, our communities, and the teachers and principals that work every day to ensure that children have a safe and healthy learning environment. John and I are going to split up the talk today. I'm going to cover the first part of the talk. I'll be talking about the concept of a safe school and introduce the idea of systems theory and its utility in understanding a phenomenon as complex as a safe and healthy school. John will enter just after that and take you through a conceptual and applied model that he's been developing for nearly a decade that we're using to better understand how schools respond to incidents so we can better equip school leaders to create and maintain safe schools. So a few ground rules. We're scheduled for about an hour. Our talk should go no more than 40 minutes, although John and I are academics, so we'll try to keep it short. We understand the point of Hopkins at Home is an interactive discussion, so we want to leave time for your comments and questions. And we should be able to do that. So there are some important facts to keep in mind as we talk. And I want to start with one that's really important to understand because I think sometimes it gets lost in discussions around safe schools and school safety. And that is, schools are very safe places. As measured by the traditional way we think about safety, usually defined in some way around violent incidents. As I already mentioned, nearly 60 million students attend public schools in the United States each day. And there are relatively few violent incidents that take place in schools or on school buses or after school activities or around schools, school communities. And schools have become even safer places over the last 2 decades as measured by violent incidents that are reported to state and federal governments. And as a result of tragic school shootings in places like Newtown, Connecticut and Parkland, Florida, discussions around safe schools have become dominated by issues of safety. So a fear of violence has really penetrated the fabric of our school systems. We now require our elementary school age and older age children to go through active shooter training, and we harden our schools by locking doors, adding bulletproof glass, and other visible security measures that make us feel safer and that send the message that we're making schools safer places. We require school resource officers, many of them armed, and biometric scanners and purchase bulletproof whiteboards, really, and contribute to the $3 billion school security industry that has emerged in the last decade. And even though we're in danger of raising a generation of children who are afraid to go to school as a result of some of these measures, there is zero evidence that any of these security measures actually make schools safer places or reduce the number of violent incidents in schools. So a narrow focus on trying to prevent or even anticipate gun violence or other violent incidents does not take into account the broader array of complex challenges that affect the safety and well-being of students, teachers, and schools. Now, gun violence is a part of that web of influence, but it's seldom understood that way, even by many school leaders across the country. That's why when you ask principals about safe schools, the first or the second or third thing that they speak about isn't typically gun violence or even violent events at all. In fact, they talk about, when you talk to principals, as we do, they talk about anxiety disorders. They talk about mental health stressors and the trauma their students experience at home or on the way to school, and how these things make it much harder for schools to focus on learning in school and for teachers and principals to do their jobs. And even as violent incidents have declined in schools over the past 2 decades, we've seen an increase in suicide and depression among teens to the point where these are common enough events that most of us know a family member or a loved one that has been affected by one or both. Now, importantly, our response to an increased focus on school safety is often inequitable. Black students and students with cognitive and intellectual disabilities, another growing population in our schools, are disproportionately targeted for discipline, suspension, and exclusion. So sometimes in the process of trying to make schools safer places and improve the safety of schools, some of the things we do actually make them less safe places for subpopulations of students, certain populations of students that are actually growing in our schools. And even as mental health needs are exploding in our schools for students and staff members, we are reducing the number of schools with mental health professionals. In fact, according to the US Department of Education's Civil Rights Division, nearly 2 million students are in schools with police but no school counselors. 3 million students are in schools with police but no nurses. 6 million students are in schools with police but no school psychologists. 10 million students are in schools with police but no social workers, and 14 million students are in schools with police but no counselor, nurse, psychologist, or social worker. These data suggest that a focus on relatively rare acts of school violence and commensurate notions of school safety, without consideration of how schools are functioning pre-event and how they recover from these incidents, misses the point and will not produce tools that school leaders can use to provide their students with safer, healthier environments. And that ultimately is what we're trying to do. In short, hardening schools and training students how to act in case of active shooters will not address the many causes of school violence and ultimately won't make schools safer, healthier places for students. So with this context and purpose in mind, about a year ago, as I said, we created our Center for Safe and Healthy Schools in the Johns Hopkins School of Education. Our goal was and is to change the national conversation about school safety and violence to one that focused on safe and healthy schools, shifting the spotlight, if you will, away from bulletproof lunch trays and adding more police to schools to addressing how schools become safe places to learn and what keeps them that way. So at its core, it's pretty darn simple. When you and I think about schools we want our children or our grandchildren or our friends to attend, I have one in middle school and one in high school in Baltimore County Public Schools, so I think about this a lot. We don't hope, and we don't pick a neighborhood or buy a property hoping that they're going to attend a school that doesn't have violent incidents. That's not how we think about it. We think about a good school. We think and we hope that they will attend schools that nurture them, that prepare them to contribute as citizens, schools where they are learning and interact with trusted adults every day who are trained to understand and address their mental health concerns. That's what all of us want for our children as they attend schools. Traditionally, schools of education haven't trained teachers and school leaders to take on an approach that includes a holistic approach to creating and maintaining safe and healthy schools. But we think the time couldn't be better to start. Even pre-COVID-19, the need to focus on social, emotional, and mental health needs of students and staff was obvious and compelling. In a post-pandemic world, the need to promote safe and healthy learning environments is even more pressing. So, how do we do this? How do we think about creating a more holistic approach to creating and maintaining safe and healthy schools? How do we think about what do we need to do to equip school leaders and teachers to ensure that students attend safer, healthier schools where they're nurtured, where there's trusted adults, where their mental health concerns are being addressed? We think adopting this approach requires us to prepare school staff and conduct new types of research. And we need new conceptual models that help us understand how schools operate in the face of incidents that challenge their safety and the health of their students and staff. And we need to understand how schools respond and whether they can be resilient in the wake of these actions. That's ultimately our goal here and what we want to talk to you about today, exactly how we're trying to do that. So with that in mind, we're working on a systems approach taken from emergency preparedness that can help us understand how different schools respond to different incidents that threaten perceptions of safety and how staff and students feel about their safety in these schools. So what you have in front of you is a slide talking about the case studies that we're looking at, and we're looking at these 3 case studies, all of which are about how schools respond to violent incidents. And in one case, at least one of them was linked to issues related to bullying and mental health, and they're all taken from 2019. Now, what's intriguing about these case studies and what started us down the path of doing research on these case studies originally was was reports from district leaders and school leaders telling us that they responded very differently to these incidents. All 3 violent incidents affected the school community. You can imagine the impact it would have on staff and students. At least one of these schools showed rapid resilience, while the others were less resilient. And we believe that understanding this resiliency and its causes can help us better understand the complexity in creating and maintaining a safe and healthy school ecosystem. So high school 1, there was a non-student shot a staff member for an incident that occurred outside of school between 2 students. High school 2, a student was stabbed after school at a bus stop yards away from the school campus. In high school 3, a high school student, after experiencing years of bullying and relentless taunts from his peers, was stabbed by a classmate. So 3 violent incidents, 3 different violent incidents, 2 of which occurred actually outside the school. And we were told by district leaders and school leaders that these schools responded very, very differently in terms of the resilience to these incidents. And we want to understand why, because we think understanding why can help us create tools for school leaders to create and maintain safe and healthy learning environments. So, as I said, leaders from the district and the schools have described the school's resiliency as being very different. Now, we might think that we could predict the resilience of these schools based on traditional indicators of what we think a good school is like, but that clearly isn't the case here, as you can see on this slide. So 3 different schools, different levels of resilience. High school 1 responded with low resilience, high school 2 with medium, high school 3 with high resilience, right? And if you look at the traditional indicators of what we might think about and use to predict a school's resilience, you can see that these schools look pretty different, right? High school 2 looks more like what we would think about as a good school. It received a high rating from the state. Students are demonstrating high levels of proficiency in math and English language. Its graduation rate is nearly 100%, but we're told going into this that its resilience actually wasn't as high as high school number 3, which has a much lower state rating, much lower English and math proficiency, and a graduation rate that's only about 2/3 of high school 2. So what's going on here? What exactly is occurring beyond these traditional indicators that could help us understand why high school 3 was so effectively and quickly responded, got back to normal, was operating at the same level post-incident as it was pre-incident so quickly, right? And that's what we're trying to understand and trying to help us understand what constitutes a safe school in this context. So if traditional variables can't predict a school's resiliency, what can? Well, we've adopted a research approach that uses a model that's built on systems thinking. Systems thinking is just like it sounds. It's built on a model and built on a way of thinking that recognizes the fact that organizations, for example, are complex, and studying only one part of the organization is not going to yield an understanding of the larger dynamics of how the parts of the organization work together or don't work together to produce outcomes. So in the case of schools, for example, you could imagine the learning that happens in an individual classroom is a function of a broader school climate and even what goes on outside the school, in the community, in the engagement between the parents and the school leaders, for example. Similarly, we might expect that an incident that challenges the cohesion of a school may have a different impact on students and staff, depending on some of the functions and factors that are operating at the classroom level, at the school level, at the community level. And all of these things are going to interact in a way that's going to produce a different outcome. So, as I said, a system is a set of interconnected components. We don't believe that understanding what constitutes a safe and healthy learning environment or school can be fully explained by understanding only one of its components. What's going on in an individual classroom, for example, or what happens at the school level without understanding what's happening at the classroom level. So that is, the system's behaviors or its effect arises out of both its components and, very importantly, their interconnections or their interactions, including feedback loops. So you can imagine a system producing data that actually comes back in and reinforces the function of another part of the system. So we are, the next slide, I'm going to hand it over to John, and he's going to take you through our approach to understanding how these schools in these contexts have responded to these incidents, and how our systems approach that he's taken from his emergency preparedness work is going to be used to make sense of this and provide tools for school leaders to help them create and maintain safe and healthy schools. John?
Thank you, Chris. So as Chris said, he pulled together a group of faculty from across the university to start thinking about these complex and profound questions around safe and healthy schools. And this entire reframing from a much narrower focus on school safety to this more expansive focus and view and perspective around safe and healthy schools. And I was lucky enough to be invited by Chris to participate in those discussions from the beginning. And as I was sitting and participating in the first round of discussions, I was thinking about the work my colleagues and I have done under CDC funding for, as Chris said, about 10 years now. So 10 years ago, CDC came to us and said, is there a way you can characterize the resilience of states? And we thought about it, and I'm going to describe a model we came up with in response to that challenge from CDC. We call this model the Copewell model. That's an acronym for Composite of Post-Event Well-Being, but really it was just a quest to get a swell acronym. And our model is all about community functioning and resilience in the face of a disaster. It could be a natural disaster, it could be a pandemic, any type of threat to a community that disrupts its functioning. This is work, as I said, that was funded by CDC. It's ongoing till this day. There are a number of centers within Hopkins that are participating, as well as the University of Delaware's Disaster Research Center. So I'm sitting at that first meeting that Chris pulled together. I'm listening to him, getting very inspired by this much more expansive view of a safe and healthy school. And I'm thinking about the complexity of characterizing all of the factors that might influence a safe and healthy school. Chris has identified some already. And thinking about how you build a way of thinking in such a complex situation. And it occurred to me, we faced the same challenge when CDC came to us and wanted us to build a model about how communities fare in a disaster. So it occurred to me that Copewell might be an approach that could be used in this safe and healthy school setting. So on the next slide, I show you the goals of Copewell, and I think you'll see a similarity with what we would want to do with schools. So it's a way to provide communities, a way to understand resilience and its influencers, assess community functioning and resilience, and spark action to enhance functioning and resilience. And honestly, if you take out the word community and put in the word school, I think you'll see that there's at least a chance that the Copewell approach could be applied to the safe and healthy school setting. So on the next slide, I showed the basics of how we think about a community in a disaster. And one of the things that's key here is we don't start by thinking about resilience per se. Rather, we think about the time course of functioning during and after a disaster. So picture a community that has a certain level of functioning before a disaster. And then a disaster hits and there's a drop in functioning. Of course, as I'm going along, you can think of the parallel with a school. So a school has a certain level of baseline functioning, and then there's a traumatic incident, and that level of functioning drops. There's an innate feature of that community or school as a, quote, system that we call resistance. That is, can the community or the school resist the drop or loss of functioning when an incident occurs? And the greater the resistance, the less that drop in functioning. But when an incident occurs, be it a natural disaster, a pandemic in a community, or a traumatic incident in a school, there'll be some loss of functioning. And then the next question is, how quickly and how much can that community or school recover? And so the upslope or second half of that functioning time course is the recovery phase. And if you put it all together, you have a baseline level of functioning, you have a drop in functioning when an incident occurs, and you have a recovery back to the pre-incident level of functioning. In engineering terms, the area under that time course, which is in the lower right depicted in green, is the resilience of that particular system. And so for a community or a school, if we can somehow predict how that community or school will react to a disaster, traumatic incident, and get a predicted time course of functioning, we can understand both the actual functioning and its change during and after the incident, and derive these important resilience indicators of resistance and recovery. So on the next slide, I talk about how we actually do this. And there's really two pieces here, and Chris has mentioned both of them. The first is, can we build a conceptual framework, a picture that aids us in identifying and thinking through the interactions amongst all the factors that might make a school safe and healthy? What makes a school a good school, and what makes a school a resilient school? And then if we had measures, that is numbers, that represent some of those factors, can we build a computer model that reflects this conceptual framework, and from that computer model actually derive predictions about how the community or the school might fare in different types of incidents? And the way we do that with Copewell is to use a very specific type of computational model called a system dynamics model. And as the name suggests, this is a dynamic model. It characterizes a community in motion, the motion being produced by the disaster. And an easy way to think about a system dynamics model is that it's a combination of what are called stocks and valves. And you can think of it as the flow of water through a system. And so stocks are reservoirs of water, and the valves control the flow of that water from one stock to another stock. In Copewell, this blue liquid, the water, is community functioning. And so we're focused on a reservoir of community functioning, how that reservoir loses water when a disaster hits, and how it regains water again over time. On the next slide, I make that a little more real. So here is the Copewell system dynamics model. And as I'm explaining this, please have two different thoughts in mind. The first is the picture itself becomes an easier, more accessible, more intuitive way to understand what is happening in a community over time during and after a disaster. And the second is when we populate the boxes of this picture with numerical values representing measures or indicators that we can get from publicly accessible databases, we can then, in a quantitative way, via a computer model, run this picture, if you will, and produce quantitative output that predicts how communities fare over time. So in this picture, in the very center, is the reservoir of community functioning. That's the one we care about. And we obviously want the level of water in that reservoir to be as high as possible. To the left, you see a brown box with a series of community functioning domains. And the numerical values for each of those domains tell us the level of community functioning at baseline in routine times without a disaster. At the very bottom of the picture, you see the event, and that event is the natural disaster, the pandemic, a traumatic incident of some sort. And there's a vertical arrow going up to a little circle with an X in it. That's a valve. And the event opens the valve, draining the community functioning water out of that reservoir. And so the event is causing a loss of functioning. In the lower left picture, you see a series of green boxes. These are the resistance factors. In the case of a community and disasters, those resistance factors are a set of population factors and prevention and mitigation factors. And what those resistance factors are doing is, in a conceptual way and a mathematical way in the computer model, fighting the event's ability to open the valve. So those resistance factors decrease the effect the event has on opening the valve, and therefore decrease the amount of water lost from that community functioning reservoir. At the very top of the slide, you see three other reservoirs, and those are the recovery factors that reintroduce functioning back into the community. And you'll see that each of those is also controlled by valves that control the flow of that replenishment water back into the community. This whole system thus represents the flow of a liquid and how the event manifests as a decrease or loss of liquid from the community functioning reservoir, and how the recovery factors are able to replenish that lost water in the community functioning reservoir. The question is there an analogy that we can use for a school? And so in thinking through that analogy, we need two things. We need a comparable picture that we can use as a framework to talk about how good a school is and how resilient a school is. And we also need a set of measures to quantitatively populate the different domains or boxes of the model so we can do quantitative predictions of resilience, as well as think through in a more subjective way the characteristics of the school. So that means we need indicators, just as we do in Copewell. So I want to show you for Copewell the types of indicators that we use, just so you get a taste of what I mean by a measure or an indicator whose value we draw from a publicly available database. So on the next slide, I show just some examples of indicators. Now, we run Copewell for every single county in the United States. That's something like 3,152 counties. And Baltimore City happens to be a county in that data set. And so just to give you an example of the types of data that we grab from publicly accessible databases for Copewell, here's the percent of housing units lacking complete plumbing facilities, and the value of a metric called the Food Environment Index. And the blue histogram in each case are all 3,152 counties in the United States, and the dashed vertical red line is the value for Baltimore City. So we're actually pretty good in terms of these individual raw metrics. If you go to the next slide, here's some examples from another domain having to do with healthcare delivery and public health services. So the number of hospital beds per 10,000 population, the percent of population with health insurance, whether a given county is public health advisory board accredited, and the population employed in healthcare support per 10,000 people. And you can see, again, by the placement of the vertical dashed red line that Baltimore City's doing quite well here. We then put all of these different types of measures or indicators together and run the Copewell model to predict the time course of functioning and the resilience factors. And on the next slide, I show you another one of these measures, just to give you another sense. So this is housing, total occupied housing units, households with over one person per room, percent severe housing problems, and households spending over 30% of income on housing. Now, for those latter two, a lower number is better, and Baltimore's doing pretty well. So I'm just trying to give you a flavor of the raw indicators. We put them all together, and now if you go to the next slide, we throw different types, magnitudes of events at the computer model and get predictions of resilience and its components, resistance and recovery. And again, I'm showing the data for all 3,152 counties in the US. The position of Baltimore, and a higher number is better. So the more to the right, that dashed vertical red line is the better. And Baltimore City is actually doing quite well in our analysis. And so the question is, how can we take this same type of systems thinking at a conceptual level and system dynamics modeling at a computational level and apply it to safe and healthy schools? And so on the next slide, I show you the current version of what we are calling Schoolwell, just to take off on Copewell, which is the notion of a safe and healthy school. And so if you think about it, what I had in the case of Copewell and community functioning called baseline functioning or routine functioning, that's what's shown in the brown boxes and circled in a blue line and labeled a good school. So what we think about as a, quote, good school are all the features of how it performs and functions on a daily basis. And you can see that some of the factors that go into that are characterizing school performance, school climate, and student functioning. Then, just as with Copewell at the bottom of this picture is some sort of initiating event, which opens a valve and drains school functioning. There's a series of resistance factors that would make the school less susceptible to a given type of traumatic initiating event. Things like social cohesion, the social capital and networking within the school, the ability to assess and mitigate threats, features of the hardening of the building and so on, bullying, monitoring, and mitigation, and so on. And those things are going to resist the effects of a traumatic event in decreasing school functioning in the first place. But we know there's going to be some decrease in functioning, and we will have a loss of functioning and need to recover from it. And so things like developing and training to a school safety program, properly trained and utilized school resource officers, and things like interoperable coordination with the local jurisdictions, public safety, so police, fire, etc., are all ways that the school is going to more rapidly recover. The principal and the teacher and their leadership abilities become an important element in deploying these recovery mechanisms. So this model, which of course is very much a work in progress, becomes a starting point for thinking about a safe and healthy school in a much more structured, systematic way. And I hope gives you a flavor of the power of systems thinking.
Thanks, John. So you can see from what John presented that one of the values and one of the reasons that we created the Center for Safe and Healthy Schools and brought together researchers from all across Hopkins is because we wanted to benefit from the models and the approaches that are being used in other divisions at Hopkins to solve very different kinds of problems and to see what value they can bring to helping us think about safe and healthy schools. So what we do think that School Well, this model ultimately can offer schools, and we're in the process of piloting it right now, is it can help characterize baseline functioning and performance, readiness to respond, efficient and effective policy and programmatic interventions, and guide interventions and assess the effectiveness and sustainability of those interventions. One of the really valuable things that John has learned as a result of applying his model in emergency preparedness in counties all across the United States is the systems type of thinking that this model introduces shows everyone in a community, in the case of a school, in the organization, outside the organization, etc., that they have a role to play in creating a safer, healthier school. So people can see themselves in this model. They can see how they can contribute. And you can look, as if you go back to this model, you can see it, that in fact, it's not just about the training in threat assessment. It's not just about the hardening of the schools. That's part of it. That's part of the resistance that this model demonstrates. But the pre-event functioning is just as, or potentially even more important than these resistance pieces that are built in the form of SRO training, active shooter training, etc. And this also builds in the role of school leaders into the model as well. So what we think School Well can offer schools is essentially a way to think about how all of these pieces fit together and how a focus on one part of the model, just the resistance piece, just the threat assessment, just the active shooter training, really isn't enough. And if you're paying attention to only that resistance part of the model and not the pre-event functioning or the rejuvenating factors of the model, you're missing out on an opportunity to create a safer and healthier school. And in fact, if you focus on pre-event functioning, these pieces of the model that focus on sort of what we traditionally think about as a good school, you're in effect going to create a baseline performance that is going to be high enough so that you can stay above a minimum threshold, even in the face of a tragic or violent incidents. So that's one of the primary projects that we're focusing on with the Center for Safe and Healthy Schools at Johns Hopkins School of Education. But we're also doing other things, and some of these things have become very valuable in a post-COVID world, or the sort of middle of the pandemic that we're in today. So we're focused on projects that include a focus on the continuity of learning and food security, health, housing, and supervision. And we're actually monitoring this and cataloging this for all of Maryland's 24 LEAs right now. And we're looking at how schools are managing to provide, in the face of the pandemic, all of these functions, some of which I think lay people and the public don't even realize that schools are doing every day. But these also, you can imagine how they fit into this pre-event functioning and the safe and healthy school, the school well model that we're talking about. So the Safe and Healthy Schools is part of the School of Education, but it's a university-wide center. We've got dozens of faculty affiliates from all across the university focused on actually understanding how all of these pieces, the systems approach to a safe and healthy school, fit together. What are the tools we can provide school leaders in the face of the challenges that they are confronting every day? And our goal essentially is here to change the focus away from all of that resistance piece in the model and thinking about a systems approach to making schools safer, healthier places. So I'll stop there. We're at the 40-minute mark, as I said, and I may have to put on my glasses to answer some questions here, but I'll go right to that. So this might be for John. From Deborah, how do you measure resilience for a school or community? How do you measure the component parts, resistance and recovery? John, I'll let you weigh in on that question, if you can see it or if you need me to read it again.
Yep, I see it. Fantastic question. So what we do with Copewell and what we're in the process of doing for Schoolwell is to identify publicly available data for each of the constructs in the model. So let's focus on Copewell for a minute. So there's a series of resistance factors, a series of recovery factors, and of course, a series of baseline functioning factors. And for every one of those different factors, we have identified data sets at the county level that have relevant measures like the housing, healthcare, and other measures I showed you where I compared Baltimore City to the other counties in the US. All of those measures we identified that represent these factors in our conceptual framework, and we literally pull data for all the counties in the US and populate a huge data set and run it through the model. What we're in the process of doing right now for Schoolwell is exactly the same thing. So for Schoolwell, we are identifying measures in publicly available data sets at the school level for schools all over the country and seeing if we can find enough publicly available data to populate the entirety of the Schoolwell model. So there may very well be factors in the Schoolwell model that we think are conceptually important that are not right now being measured in this country in schools across the country, in which case we will go to individual school districts. We're starting to work with Baltimore City already to get custom data that the district may have that's not published in a publicly available way. And by populating the computer model with these data, we're able to generate quantitative predictions of the school's functioning over time after a traumatic incident, and from that, its resilience.
So a question from JT, how do we encourage communities to focus on holistic health safety of a school in a broad sense, rather than the very rare but dramatic incidents that tend to generate the most fear? And you're exactly right, JT. That's a central purpose of why we created the Center for Safe and Healthy Schools to start with. There has been a tremendous focus on communities and schools and pressure on school leaders to focus on hardening of schools and demonstrating that they could withstand an attack or identify, someone who might be a threat to the school. And I think what the school well model, what we're trying to do with the school well model is we're trying to make the case empirically, because we don't think we can make it just conceptually. The models are nice, but we need to be able to actually have data to demonstrate this. Is we want to be able to demonstrate empirically that a school that is high on pre-event functioning or high on, whoops, I did the wrong thing there, high on the recovery factors, is going to do well in the face of an incident, even controlling for the resistance factors, where so much of the attention is on threat assessment, hardening a school, monitoring bullying, those kinds of things, which are important. But we want to make the case empirically that if you invest in these other places, you will actually be a more resilient school. And in the process, your pre-event functioning, which is ultimately what we're after here, right? We're ultimately after how do we create the best pre-event functioning we possibly can. And if this model can help us refocus the attention on that, we think it'll be successful. John, the question
So,
for
yeah, I can see it. So, yeah, I'm gonna pick up on what Chris is saying and answer a couple of other questions. So I hope we've convinced you that systems thinking is a very comprehensive, holistic way to think about what is in fact a complex and dynamic situation. Part of why we're motivated to think this way is because the focus on school safety is too narrow a focus, and it's too narrow a focus in two ways. The first is, even if what you're ultimately after is just school safety, viewing it too narrowly doesn't get you to a safe school, because the range of factors that influence even something as quote narrow as school safety is actually a broad range. But as Chris is saying, what we're really interested in at the end of the day is a school that is functioning and performing as well as it can be in routine times and is resilient to traumatic events. And if we have a finite amount of resources to lift up that school, both in terms of its daily functioning and its resilience in the face of a traumatic event, the question is, how do we spend those resources? Do we spend it on baseline functioning? Do we spend it on resilience? And having a comprehensive, systematic model such as Schoolwell is a way to think through priorities and a way to not lose focus on the overall goal. The overall goal being a safe and healthy school, not just school safety. And again, if you have very poor pre-event functioning, baseline functioning very poor, you, even in the context of school safety, you may want to spend, quote, school safety resources lifting up the baseline functioning, because a school will come out the other side of a traumatic incident better if it starts with better functioning, all else being equal. Now, what I just illustrated, I hope, is an ability to use Schoolwell as a conceptual framework, a picture, to have a more systematic, comprehensive, and inclusive conversation about even school safety. That is independent of what we call geographic scale. And the same thing is true of Copewell as a tool for communities to get more resilient around disasters. So even though the data we use in the computational model for Copewell is at the county level, we have actually applied Copewell at different geographic scales, at a state scale, at a neighborhood scale, at a city scale, not just at a county scale. The same thing could be said of Schoolwell. We could go into schools right now and use this picture as a way to have more orderly conversation about safe and healthy schools, completely in the absence of data. And we saw with all our Copewell work that just having a picture to structure conversation around is itself an advance and of high utility. But with Copewell, as I said, it's very hard to get data at a neighborhood level all over the country. And so what we've done for Copewell is to build a set of self-assessment tools that complement the quantitative data we have from publicly available databases at the county level. With Schoolwell, we intend to do the same thing. So right now, because it would be awesome and amazing and of high value if we could, we really are trying to get publicly available data from all over the country at the school level. And as I've indicated, where right now we're having trouble with that, we're going to the district directly. But we intend to complement all of that with a set of self-assessment tools, as we've done with Copewell, so that schools and their communities can self-assess in the absence of enough publicly available data to populate the model.
So Max asked a question: which portions of the system have you observed already or predict in future applications that are met with the most resistance from public schools and parents? That's a great question. I don't think we're there yet, Max, that we know that we know what's going to be resisted from schools. I can tell you that when we initially came and had a discussion with the local superintendent and her team, they immediately grasped the model. And I think part of it is showing the picture and this picture tells a lot of the story. So I think the picture helps people understand immediately. Where I think the resistance may come from is potentially would be the fact that this really changes, as John said, the focus from really a school safety approach, which is arguably largely in the green boxes and to some degree in the recovery boxes as well, and changes it to back to a focus on the pre-event functioning pieces, the pieces of what is a good school. So it'll be interesting to see if we can demonstrate empirically using the publicly available data that we're putting forward, if we can demonstrate that part of the resilience function in a school is it can be traced back to how that school is doing on very fundamental things like learning. It'll be very interesting to see how much resistance we do get from that, or if people, parents, schools, policymakers can grasp that in the context of that empirical demonstration. There was a question also about how might data that stems from the center and the center's work inform changes to education and training of school administrators. That's from Carol. Thank you, Carol. That's a great question. And I will say that prior to the creation of the center, not only were our school administrators that we were training in the School of Education, but our teachers, our education prep programs, didn't have anything in them, components in them related to safe and healthy schools. I'm proud to say that now every school counselor, a school administrator, and teacher that graduates from the School of Education has had a required module, at least a single module, if not multiple modules, that speak to safe and healthy schools. So we are using this model. We're using the research we're doing, and the director of our administration and supervision program, Annette Anderson, is deputy director of the Safe and Healthy School Center. And I know that she's using this in the training that we provide for our school administrators. And I know that's true of our school counselors and our teacher preparation students as well. They are getting training that I think is unlike they're getting in any other school of education around the pieces of a safe and healthy school, It's not required by the state, not required for national boards, but we think it's important for our preparation students to get. Hannah, did we get to all the questions? How can parents and people in the community get involved in school while work? Is that possible? That's a great question. Right now, we are in the process, as John said, of putting together the data that we're going to use to populate the model. And I think as soon as we do that, and we can demonstrate via these case studies the merit of the model, at that point, we want to bring together people from the community to provide input into the model, because ultimately the utility of what we can provide is going to have to be measured in whether parents and schools are actually using the work that we're producing in the center to make their schools safer, healthier places. So we certainly want to bring together parents and school leaders to look at the data and the model that we're producing here. So I think we're at our time here. It's 12:57. John, if you had any final comments, I'd certainly allow you to do that. But otherwise, we can finish up.
Thank you all very much for your interest in what we're doing. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, and do please stay tuned. There is the website for the Center for Safe and Healthy Schools is available at the School of Education's website. Education.jhu.edu is the School of Education at Johns Hopkins. Please visit that site if you're interested in seeing more about our work. There are other research reports, other activities that we're doing in the center there. We're going to be releasing this spring a whole new suite of continuing education units for principals and teachers from all around the country. We're going to be the first, I believe, school of education in the country to do that, and we'll be certifying both schools and school leaders around the concepts of safe and healthy schools, a holistic approach to safe and healthy schools, as we've described here. So more to come on that. Stay tuned, and please do visit the School of Education's website. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.